My name is Bob Jacobson, and I'm here to welcome you all to the day before Halloween Writers at Work. This is actually a wonderful event because we have as our key speaker, Professor, I want to make sure I get this right, Associate Professor of... I was promoted. You were promoted, excellent, even better. Professor in the Department of African American Studies, Nikki Jones. She came here a little while ago from Santa Barbara, and we're very pleased to have her. Her current research work is on systematic analysis of video records that document routine encounters between police and civilians, with a focus on encounters that involve the police and Black youth in high surveillance neighborhoods. She works with the Center for Race and Gender, the Department of Women and Gender Studies, and the Center for Study of Law and Society at UC Berkeley. But more to the topic of Writers at Work, she has worked in media ranging from academic essays, papers, and even 2 books. So I'm sure she'll have a lot to tell us about the practice of writing, and I look forward to it. Welcome, Professor Nikki Jones.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for being here. Thank you, Bob, for the introduction. Thank you, John, for the invitation to come and talk about writing. As my graduate students know, I love to talk about writing. I don't always get the opportunity to do so. And thank you to everyone involved with setting up the event today. And I also want to thank my class. So I'm actually in the middle of a graduate seminar. I'm teaching interdisciplinary research methods. And so for the second half of class, we are here today talking about writing. You all can raise your hand. Yeah, so here we are. And so what I wanted to do today, when I was invited to talk about writing, was to think about how I'm in fact making sense of my writing over a period of now 15 years as a scholar. And part of that effort is driven by my experience since coming to Cal to teach in the Department of African American Studies and the kinds of questions that have been brought to me from students. And so in order to understand my writing and how I talk to students about writing, how I think about writing, it's important to understand who I am, right, and the kind of paradigms that influence my work. And I've been working on this for an appendix for a second edition of Between Good and Ghetto. And I call this the little book that could, right? It's a short book, concise, but it has continued to have resonance for many of its readers, particularly young Black women. And so I've encountered young Black women on college campuses around the country who will say, that is my story. And as an ethnographer, that is a huge compliment because it means that not only have you represented a segment of the community in a way that they see as respectful and full of dignity and love and care, but that also you got the analysis right, that you got the analysis as right as you could. And so what I'm going to do today is share that introduction to that appendix the second appendix that I'm working on for that new edition. And talk to you about some of the questions that I'm grappling with as I'm moving through and kind of making sense of the work that I've produced. And then I'll share a few excerpts that kind of walk us through that. And these are excerpts that are described as ethnographic scenes, right? Stories on a page. And then we'll have a conversation about some of the writing choices I make and how I do all that. So I'll start just with the introduction to what this appendix in progress. So I joined the Department of African American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley in 2014 after nearly a decade as a faculty member in the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And while I teach a similar set of courses in my new department, including courses on qualitative research methods and ethnography, my classrooms now include many more Black women, women of color, and students from a broader range of backgrounds and disciplines than I experienced at UCSB. My students are interested in the basics of field research, but they also bring a distinct set of questions to the work, questions that are informed by who they are and who they hope to become as an academic. The question of who they hope to be is often accompanied by an anxiety that is familiar to many graduate students, especially those who occupy spaces on the margins of the academy. Some of these students are acutely aware of what Elijah Anderson has described as their provisional status. They understand that even if the majority of students are not white, the university is still white space, which means that the burden falls on my students to prove that they belong here. And even if they know that they don't quite belong, it is belonging they want. They want to be taken seriously, as seriously as their white counterparts. They also want their work to matter for the people that they study, for Black people, and often for Black women and girls. This desire is what leads them to Black feminist thought, or Black feminist thought leads them to the academy, and eventually to my classroom, where they want to learn how to do Black feminist work well. My engagement with students over the last several years has encouraged, in fact, required me to think more deeply about not only what it means to conduct and complete a sound ethnographic project, but also what it means to do Black feminist ethnography. How does who we are as professionals in training, and people with particular standpoints shape what we know, can know, or want to know? How does or should a Black feminist epistemology inform the development of our research and writing? What makes a project intersectional? How does one condense and accurately represent the complexity of Black humanity in a research presentation, paper, or book? Finally, as Black feminist literary critic Barbara Christian once asked, what is this all for anyway? Over the last several years, I've worked to answer this set of questions with and for my students, as well as for myself. In this essay, I reflect on how these questions have informed the choices I've made and continue to make while researching and publishing 2 book-length ethnographies, Between Good and Ghetto, African American Girls and Inner City Violence, and The Chosen Ones, Black Men and the Politics of Redemption, and how my efforts to answer these questions has helped to clarify what Black feminist ethnography means to me and the important contribution our work makes to various fields of knowledge. So that's the brief excerpt from the introduction. And briefly, for those who aren't familiar, Black feminist thought, what is Black feminist thought? It refers to the collective wisdom, right, of Black women. It is a way of knowing that emphasizes the importance of standpoint. In Black feminist thought, the book, Patricia Hill Collins, outlines 4 key characteristics of Black feminist thought or a Black feminist epistemology: the value of lived experience, so an appreciation of subjectivity, the importance of dialogue, right? So understanding that knowledge is produced in conversation with others, an ethic of caring, and an ethic of personal responsibility. To whom am I accountable is a question that you are asking yourself as you're doing this work. And when I think about my work as an urban sociologist, as an urban ethnographer, I do think it's that Black feminist epistemology that sets my work apart from other projects, including my use of intersectionality as an interpretive framework, and also my focus on interactionism. So for me, the site of my analysis is often focused on what Irving Goffman described as the interaction order, what people do together when they're in face-to-face contact. And so you see all of this, I think, in my ethnographic work. You see the questions that I'm trying to figure out are informed by this epistemology. And one of the key questions, and this has become more clear to me as I'm looking through my prior work, is me trying to figure out the gendered consequences of the system's touch on Black people, on Black youth, and Black women, and Black girls and Black men and boys, the gendered consequences of the system's touch, the criminal justice system, the criminal legal system. And to the extent that I've done work over a significant period of the beginning of the 21st century, it is also a reflection on a particular historical moment as well. And so I'm going to share some excerpts, and I stepped on my reading glasses, so I'm going to do my best here. I'm going to read a few excerpts, 2 from the first book and 2 from the second book, and I'll just talk to you a little bit about how I see these excerpts strung together. And so the first excerpt that I'll read is from the introduction of Between Good and Ghetto. So early on a weekday morning, a few minutes past the beginning of the school day, the line of students that snakes into the front door of Martin Luther King High School in South Philadelphia is no longer in sight. Known locally as the Prison on the Hill, the large gray building sits atop a modest rise in one of the city's most troubled neighborhoods. Across the street from the school's main entrance is a cement parking lot that sometimes doubles as a playground for the neighboring public elementary school. The school is bordered by a busy freeway on one side and the Carver Projects, a collection of low-rise public housing apartments, on the other side. Some units that once faced the school's back entrance have been torn down. Slowly, they are being replaced by newly designed structures that resemble small-scale townhomes. Police officers patrol the housing project's borders often, and occasionally officers respond to calls from inside the high school as well. On most days, however, uniformed guards screen students and visitors and monitor school safety. Security checks endured by hundreds of Martin Luther King High students each morning resemble the methodical screenings required of all visitors to the city's courts, criminal justice center, and correctional facilities. The high school security clearance procedures serve as a not-so-subtle reminder that for many adolescent inner-city boys and girls, the beginning of the school day is not an escape from the threats of violence that accompany life in the neighborhoods that surround the school. I approach the school's entrance and look on as a brown-skinned teenage girl a few steps ahead of me in line begins the screening process. She walks up the steps leading into the building, removes her backpack from her shoulder, and places it on a belt that moves the bag through an X-ray machine. Any metal object in her bag, a small knife or a razor blade, for example, should cause the machine to beep loudly. A moment passes, no beep sound. As her bag moves through the X-ray machine, the student steps through a door frame-shaped metal detector. Again, no beeps. A uniformed security officer stops her on the school-sided security gate. With little obvious prompting, she raises her arms parallel to the ground and looks to the side. I notice the seriousness of her expression as the security guard pats her down. He moves his hands under her arms and pats her back. He then quickly glides his hand across one outstretched arm and then the other. Then both hands travel down her sides. He moves both hands down her right leg and then her left. Finally, he squeezes her jeans pockets, lets out a short, nervous laugh, and releases her. She returns his laugh with a reluctant smile, grabs her bag from the security belt, and heads to the next table, just a few steps away. There, she swipes her identification card in a card reader that is positioned in front of another guard who is facing a monitor. The student's name and picture flash on the screen. The guard looks at the screen and then looks at her. She walks away. "Wait," the guard calls, "take your late pass." The student returns, takes her pass, and walks off in silence to begin her school day. This girl's ritualized passage into her high school is just one indicator of how the circumstances of inner-city life, and especially the threat of interpersonal violence, structures teenage girls' daily lives. Each school day morning, this adolescent girl, like her peers, receives the same screenings as the boys. Girls are not exempt from a hands-on search or from any other form of school-based surveillance simply because they are girls. Indeed, adolescent girls who attend troubled public high schools are increasingly subject to such screenings and sanctions as worries about school violence have expanded to include fights between girls. Such battles, including ones in which combatants brandish knives or box cutters, occur often enough to legitimate the fears of school administrators, teachers, parents, and students. The conversations I had over the 3 years of fieldwork for this book revealed the regularity of this violence. Teenage girls describe themselves or others getting rolled on or jumped or being involved in a fair one gone bad. Like their male counterparts, girls could readily name someone who had been shot, robbed, or stabbed. Girls also disclose witnessing this violence directly. So in that excerpt, I'm literally trying to show, not tell, and I'm sure this is something that John shares with folks often, trying to show the way that the criminal justice system's response to violence in a particular neighborhood structures the daily lives of Black girls. And why does that matter? In part because the discourse, at least at this time, around urban violence did not include Black women and girls, right? It was as if somehow the buffer of gender protected them from that. But if you know anything about the history of Black women and girls, you know that has never been true, right? And so it wouldn't have been true at this moment as well. And so I'm trying to show that. In another excerpt that I'll read today, and in Between Good and Ghetto, I'm thinking about how girls stay safe, right, in the inner city at that time. And thinking about different types of violence, and so neighborhood violence, interpersonal violence, and gender-specific or intimate violence. And again, thinking about the relation to the criminal justice system. And in one of the chapters, I write about the experience of a young Black woman that I call Amber, who was negotiating a relationship with the father of her young child, and who was also abusive. Right, at times. And so what I'll read now is another ethnographic scene from a visit that I made to Amber. Excuse me. And so I'm visiting Amber after she had already spent some time in a group home. So Amber's 2-year stay in the group home never transitioned into independent living. When she finally left, she had no certified job skills and no income other than her $516 monthly payment she received from welfare. She also had no place to live, and so she and her son moved in with her mother and stepfather, sharing their 2-bedroom apartment on a relatively quiet city block in North Philadelphia. The quiet of the block is sustained in part by the presence of several abandoned buildings, each marked with the familiar city-issued orange condemned signs. A large stone Baptist church sits on a corner across from Amber's new home, and another church occupies the opposite corner. The building that contains Amber's apartment is divided into 3 floors. It's quiet around here, especially at night, Amber tells me, after greeting me at the door of the building. She and I walk up 2 flights of stairs to reach her mother's apartment. The neatly furnished 2-bedroom unit Amber ushers me into, I learn shortly, accommodates not only her and her son and her mother and stepfather, but also Marvin, and that's her partner. Since Amber's departure from the group home, he has come to the apartment occasionally to spend the night with her. This visit will mark my first witnessing Amber's interactions with her baby's father. When we sit down in the small living room, I ask Amber how she's doing, and she says fine. She looks as if she has gained at least 10 pounds since leaving the group home weeks ago. Keenan, who is nearly 3, that's her son, also has grown mostly up, stretching his vanilla cream-colored baby fat rolls into a smooth thinness. Amber says she is happy to be out of the group home and reports that she is looking for a job. While we talk, her stepfather comes out of the bathroom and says hello before going to a back room. Amber is sitting across from me, looking nervously, it seems, in the direction of the 2nd bedroom. I don't know who or what is in the bedroom, and I'm sure why Amber appears uneasy. I ask, almost in a whisper, if it is okay for us to talk. Yeah, she assures me. We continue for a few more minutes, but she remains distracted. Then I think to ask about Marvin. And what about your boyfriend? At the same moment, the door of the 2nd bedroom opens, and Amber's eyes dart in that direction. A young, light-skinned man with braided hair, dressed in an extra-large white t-shirt over loose-fitting gym shorts, steps into the living room. Here he is, she says. Oh, this is him, I respond. As he makes his way through the living room, Marvin doesn't look at Amber or at me. Amber introduces me anyway. I reach out my hand, and he extends his only long enough to give me a weak shake. He barely stops before continuing to a front room beyond the kitchen. As Amber and I continue to talk, she holds Keenan on her lap, planting kisses on his cheek. He seems comfortable and leaves his mother's embrace only for periodic trips to the front room to bring me a toy. Amber tells me that she cannot read very well and thinks that she needs to take a literacy class before enrolling in a GED program. The GED classes cost $398, and she does not want to waste her money. As we talk, Marvin periodically walks back and forth from the front room to the bedroom. Every time he walks into the room, Amber tightens up and stares at him, as if trying to predict his next move. The tension and potential for violence that she confronts in her relationship with Marvin is tangible. I quickly wrap up our discussion, and after Marvin walks into the bedroom and shuts the door behind him, Amber motions to me that we should go downstairs. Okay, I say, do you want to walk me down? Once downstairs, Amber confides that she only recently got back with Marvin. We got into another fight, she says, holding out her left arm for my inspection. What happened, I asked, staring at the 3 scars on her arm. I got another court date, too, she continues. Are you going to go this time, I ask? Yeah, I'm going to go. I told him to, because next time, if I don't go next time when I call for help, they're probably not going to help me. And so I share that excerpt, for this particular purpose. One of the things I was trying to do there was to convey the experience of being in that relationship, to kind of convey how the air felt, the air shifted in the room, and to show that is something that Amber was living with. Also in that chapter, I highlight the limits of the criminal justice system as a response to Amber's experience, into offering protection, in part because of its limits, and also because Amber doesn't want to see Marvin become more enmeshed with the criminal justice system. And so, I follow that analysis a bit more in the chapter. And in talking about the book after its publication with people, it became clear to me that nobody liked Marvin, right? There was no sympathy for Marvin. But as a researcher, and I didn't have time to get into that in Between Good and Ghetto, I was really curious about Marvin. So what is Marvin's experience about? What is his source of powerlessness? What is it that violence is doing for him in that moment? How was that constructing the experience? And so when I got into the work for The Chosen Ones, which is still, right, a Black feminist ethnography, although it centers the experiences of Black men and boys, this was a question, right, that I carried with me into the new work. And there's a chapter in The Chosen One Targets where I kind of lay out an analysis of how I see the structural changes over time when it comes to policing violence in neighborhoods, like neighborhoods I was in Philadelphia and the neighborhoods in the Fillmore, make their way into and through the bodies and minds of people, right, in these communities, and are sometimes dispersed onto the bodies and minds of others. And the consequences that has for young Black men and boys, and which moved me forward in thinking about police violence as gendered violence and a form of gender-specific violence, in the same way I was thinking about the gender-specific kinds of violence that Black women and girls were encountering in Philadelphia. And so I'll share an excerpt that for me helped to reveal that sense of powerlessness and kind of picks up where the analysis leaves off in between good and ghetto. And this is an excerpt from a boys group meeting that I attended over the period of a year, that the young boys who were coming lived in one of the most troubled housing complexes in the neighborhood. So an example of a young bystander's sense of powerlessness emerged during a weekly meeting for adolescent boys that I attended in an effort to observe one former hustler's changing role in the neighborhood. Lincoln, an African-American man, acted as a social father to several local youth, helping them and their peers process difficult events in the neighborhood, including the social meaning of arrests. I wrote this field note shortly after one of the meetings that Lincoln led, and so now I'm shifting to the field note. I arrive at one of the meetings, and a group of about 12 boys is arranged around the tables, which are shaped like an L. When Lincoln asks if I have anything to say to the boys, I say I do not. Lincoln does. He asks the group what they think about Ed getting beat up. When I ask who Ed is, Lincoln tells me he is the son of the housing complex's maintenance worker and that it was the police who beat him. He explains that the police got a call that a Black man wearing a white T-shirt had a gun. That description, as Lincoln notes, is broad enough to fit everyone present, right? Black man in white T-shirt. When the police arrived, they arrested Ed, handcuffed him, and then slammed him to the ground. Lincoln says he had never seen that, slamming a cuffed suspect to the ground, happen before. Ed had a cut on his head above his eyebrow, and he resisted getting thrown into the back of the police car. Once forced inside, he kicked out the back window. Some of the boys at the meeting witnessed this dramatic scene. They seemed saddened and frustrated by the events. They asked the whole group how that kind of an event makes them feel. One boy says that it makes you feel like you want to hurt the police. When I say that I can understand that feeling, Lincoln counters quickly, reminding the boys that they cannot hurt the police. He then returns to my original question, asking about their feelings. One of the younger boys, about 12 years old, answers, saying that what happened to Ed makes him feel like it is racist, like the police do not like Black people, like they deliberately go after the older Black men so that just young boys like them are going to be left, and then they will need a pass to get on housing complex property. I ask if the treatment of Ed makes them feel like the police are there for them. They say no, adding that the police do not care if somebody gets shot. When I question how it makes him feel about power, one boy says he feels like he has no power. I probe, repeating his answer, which he confirms. Then I ask the group what they can do if they have no power. Stay out of trouble, do well in school, one boy suggests, pressing. I ask what else, and the often boisterous group falls silent. Shortly after this conversation, I said my goodbyes to the group so that I could prepare for an early flight from San Francisco to Santa Barbara, where I was scheduled to teach a class the next day. I rose from the table and made my way to the door. As I placed my hand on the door's handle, one of the young men from this group, a teenager that I had interacted with previously and had always treated me with deference and respect, lofted a loud farewell into the air. Bye, sexy. I was stunned by the young man's transgression, but I did not respond. Instead, I let the inappropriate comment hang in the air as I completed my exit from the room. I was sure that Lincoln would scold the young man for his lack of respect, a lesson that he sometimes punctuated with a swift jab to a boy's chest. In the moment, however, I understood the young man's actions with a clarity that I had never had before. The source of the young man's sense of powerlessness was palpable. I had just participated in a conversation that exposed his vulnerability to dominance and aggression at the hands of the police. I understood that in that moment, bisexy was a desperate grasp at a semblance of power and control after having his sense of powerlessness laid bare before me. Although young, he has already learned that his effort to regain a sense of dominance to save the face of his budding manhood required a female body. My status as a professor, or as Lincoln implored repeatedly during the group's tenure, a lady, could not withstand this pressure. Understood in this way, bisexy is also more than an adolescent's effort to prove his manhood among his peers. It is an effort to escape his own vulnerability, the same sort of vulnerability that women and girls are exposed to regularly. If he had not made such an effort, then he would have to settle in with the social fact that is contrary to his understanding of what it means to be a man, that he is in fact embedded in a set of power relations that make him more like a woman or girl than he would like to admit. His one-off comment demonstrates that he, and by proxy the group, since he is something of a leader among his peers, still has a hold on manhood. The routine interventions of the police may threaten the neighborhood's gendered hierarchy, but in that room for that moment, the hierarchy still stands. And so that's just one example, and it was an ethnographic example of how, and I could see really clearly in that moment, how the aggression of that police incident traveled through the group, right, and onto my body. And then I began to think through the course of this work, the other ways in which that violence is gendered, and how the violence experienced by Black men and boys is also at times structurally, at the hands of the police, is also at times structurally similar to the violence that Black women and girls experience when it comes to intimate violence or sexual violence, and that it has an impact as well. And so I began thinking about the stop and search, right, as a form of gendered violence. And so the last excerpt that I'll read today is me looking at the stop and search or a particular kind of police interaction, the strip search, through that lens. After a young man from the neighborhood shares his experience in public of being strip searched by the police. And so we are at another meeting. This time it's a meeting it's tenants meeting that was called in the same housing complex in the wake of a series of evictions in the neighborhood, in the complex, I should say. So the meeting was called to address a recent wave of evictions from the housing complex. The notices informed the tenants that they were being evicted because they had committed, permitted, or failed to prevent criminal activity either in or near their unit. Over the course of the night, the mainly low-income residents and attendants also discussed the gang injunction and the relationship between the community and the police in general. And again, you should be picking up by now the way that the criminal justice system saturates life in neighborhoods, the kinds of neighborhoods that I'm writing about, and structures the most routine kinds of interactions. Near the end of the meeting, Larry, one of Lincoln's sons, shared his account of what he believed to be an overly harsh and intrusive encounter with the police during his recent detention at the local police station. He told the group that he was taken to the local station, as he described it, strip search. He looked saddened and frustrated as he shared his experience and searched for possible remedies from the group. Several weeks after Larry's public disclosure of this intrusive encounter with the police, he and I attended a boys' group meeting. There, I witnessed how Larry's feelings of frustration and anger lingered nearly a month after the initial incident. So now I'm going to read from my field note. It is about 7:30 at night. It's dark outside. The meeting has ended. The boys finish the plates of food that are provided at each meeting, and one by one or in pairs begin to trickle out of the meeting area. As they exit, the attention of the group is drawn to two police cars that have pulled into the parking lot adjacent to the meeting room's entrance. The group then begins to move outside en masse. "What's going on?" I ask into the crowd of bystanders that has quickly gathered to observe the impending scene. I notice Lincoln has taken a stand near the officers. There are 4 officers on the scene. Lincoln says that the officers are claiming that 3 of the boys attending the meeting broke into a resident's home, but he says the boys were in the room the whole time. A small group of kids between the ages of 8 and 11 gather around the officers. "Who's snitching? Who's a snitch?" they yell at the officer. "You a snitch," the officer responds as he points to one of the kids. Lincoln orders the kids to run on. As Lincoln engages the officers, the older boys in the group walk away, spreading out like water on pavement as they make their way across the street and away from the officers. As I observe the scene, I hear Larry's voice rise from the crowd of observers. Larry is a senior in high school. He's been studying for the state-mandated exit exam, and I provided some support for him along the way. "Not tonight, not tonight," he repeats in a monotone chant. "Y'all ain't taking me in tonight," bouncing on his toes like a boxer getting ready for a match. "You're not going to strip search me," he says. "That's illegal." Larry makes his way over to me. He continues to bounce and chant as we observe the scene from the railing that separates the entrance from the parking lot. He raises his voice and begins to yell in the direction of the officers. I turn to him to get his attention and adopt a low, soft tone as I encourage him to calm down. He pauses for a moment to share the source of his frustrations with me directly. "It's frustrating," he says. "They can come up here, take me to the station, strip search me, and I can't do anything back to them." I tell him that I understand, but the way to get back at them is by taking and passing his exit exam. "You're trying to go somewhere," I say. I encourage him not to court the police into disrupting his path. He takes my suggestion in before retreating back into the crowd of bystanders. Larry's behavior that night was among the most memorable observations from my time in the neighborhood. It stood out not simply because Larry was challenging the legitimacy of the police. It is not uncommon for bystanders to launch accusations in the direction of officers from the outskirts of an encounter. Rather, I was struck by the specificity of Larry's accusation. You're not going to strip search me, that's illegal. His accusation made public an intimate violation experienced by Larry at the hands of the police. Larry's display of frustration and anger also stood out because of the public way in which he broadcast his vulnerability, a departure from the silence that typically surrounds the experience of sexual violence experienced by women and some forms of violent victimization experienced by Black men. In a study of the victims of gun violence, for example, Ji-Young Lee found that a heavy silence hung around injuries that threaten one's manhood in actual or symbolic ways, since, quote, an injury in or near a man's genitalia might jeopardize his elite status and transform him into a quote-unquote freak in the eyes of his peers. Here, Larry risked any threat to his manhood that might accompany his public disclosure and instead shared his experience of being strip searched with all within earshot. In doing so, he made clear that his effort to confront the police was motivated by his past violation, a violation that is often hidden from the public. Now, on his home turf, Larry provoked the police in an effort not only to repair the injury done to him during the strip search, but also to right the power imbalance that had lingered since the incident. Larry's effort to break this silence came with a risk. In fighting against this otherwise invisible cage of constraint, and that's drawing on Patricia Collins' work, Larry opened himself up to the potential for harsher forms of bodily control, including the possibility of lethal violence at the hands of the police, a threat from which I hope to insulate him in my efforts to redirect his frustration. In hindsight, my attempts to protect him also acted as a form of constraint. By encouraging him to retreat, I forestalled any revolutionary potential that may have existed in his efforts to directly confront the police. And so, in that last observation, and that's the kind of observation that I have as I'm conducting the analysis and writing it up, the fieldwork I was doing was before Black Lives Matter, before the killing of Michael Brown. And so one of the things I think about in this work is how my own reactions in the moment, right, reflect a set of understandings of what it means to be safe. But in doing so, can also reproduce the conditions, right, to which young people are objecting. And that's, one example of that. And then what happens, what is the kind of abolitionist potential, right, of a different kind of response? Right? What is the potential to actually transform the system, right? If we can organize our actions around something other than simply protection, right? Keeping safe. And that's something that I'm still continuing to think through in the work. But I offer up those excerpts just to kind of, because I'm working to identify some through lines in the analysis, and also because I think they're illustrations of ethnographic scenes and the kinds of, we can talk more about the kinds of things that I'm trying to do as I'm working to represent the social world as accurately as I can, understanding the context within which the Black people and the Black women and girls and boys and men that I'm writing about are being represented, and how that influences my choices. So I'll stop there, and then we can start our conversation. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is John Levine from the College Writing Programs, and I want to thank Professor Nikki Jones for agreeing to be with us today to talk a little bit about her writing process, her research process. I also want to thank the Morrison Library for hosting this event. We're very fortunate to be able to hold our event here. And I want to just tell you a little bit about the format. We will talk a little bit we'll talk probably for about 45 minutes about writing, about research, about the writing process. And then at the end, there'll be time for questions from the audience. So I know there are a lot of students here. I know my students are here and they've got a lot of questions. So we'll pack a lot into a short period of time. So actually, I have questions prepared, but I have a whole new set of questions after hearing you read and what you had to say. I first became aware of your work when I attended a standing room only event around The Chosen Ones. And this was sponsored by the Berkeley Underground Scholars, American Cultures, the Study of Law and Society, and other groups on campus. And I knew at that time that you would be a perfect candidate for this event because I was, number one, interested in the topic, but also you, I could tell that you are a very thoughtful writer, very thoughtful researcher, and I was hoping that we could tap into that a little bit today.
Thank you.
Great, good. So I'm going to skip to a question on my third page because I read both of these books. I read The Chosen Ones first, your most recent book, and then I went back and read Between Good and Ghetto. And it's interesting to read them in those words. I was very impressed with both of them. My first question, you sort of touched on this, was at what point in working on this, doing your field work or actually finishing the book, did you know that you were going to get to, so focusing on young women in an urban setting, that you were going to get to young men in an urban setting? What was the
So I didn't know yet when I was finishing. So in Between Good and Ghetto is also based on is a big leap for my dissertation, but the fieldwork was also conducted during my my graduate studies, and so I wasn't thinking of that my next project was going to be on Black men and boys, and that kind of evolved just through the way that I got into the neighborhood and then the kind of networks that developed once I got into the neighborhood. But what I knew that would be consistent and what is consistent is the interrogation of mainstream hegemonic gender ideologies and local gender ideologies, and so Black gender ideologies. And so when you're looking at both texts, what you see is me kind of thinking through and trying to make sense of how people are making sense of their understanding of the constraints of these systems. And I think about them as systems of accountability. And they're making sense of these systems of accountability while also having to do like the kind of routine things that we do in our daily lives and looking at through the lens of violence. That means kind of staying safe in the first book. And in the second book, that means changing your life, becoming a different kind of person, but not only a different kind of person, in this context, becoming a different kind of man, understanding what that meant in this really local setting.
Right.
And so I wasn't necessarily making a huge, thinking that I was going to make a huge shift in that way, but I understood that these kind of key concerns would remain in my work. And I think one of the things that is unique about the contribution of both is that most urban ethnographers don't have the opportunity to kind of spend that time thinking about gender and the intersection of mainstream and Black gender and ideologies in that way across groups. And now that I've done that, I feel like I've answered a set of questions for myself that I hope are also useful for other people as well. Yeah, in the representation. Yeah.
And as you were talking, you said you're still thinking through these. You know, you're going back to Between Good and Ghetto and thinking about the issues, but also thinking about your methods and your process of approaching these.
Yeah.
Do you remember when it was that you first got the idea to write The Chosen Ones? Were you, and related to that, in Between Good and Ghetto, you were based in the Philadelphia area, and is that what drew you to that setting? And likewise, were you in the Bay Area and you decided to focus on the Fillmore?
So The Chosen Ones, the first kind of germen of an idea emerged when I was doing my graduate work in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania, and I was sitting in on a program run by Lori Pompa at Temple University, Inside Out Prison Exchange Program. And so we were working together, and she was starting the first class of this program. It brings in half students from the university, and the other half of the students are incarcerated men who were incarcerated at Graterford prison outside of Philadelphia. And we were in that class, and I was going each week with them, a group of men and a group of students. And I remember a guy in the class was going to be released. And he had been a really kind of otherwise relatively quiet guy, but on this day he was very anxious, and he was, it just kind of took up space in a way that he hadn't previously. And he would say this thing, when I get out of here, I'm going to go home, I'm going to sit on my porch, I'm going to drink my lemonade, and whatever happens, happens. And at that moment, it occurred to me that, what does freedom mean if having had your liberty taken away and to go home to still feel as if you are not, you have to fight for your freedom in some way, or that freedom is vulnerable, is precarious, right? Because that's what he was talking about. Like, if people still have beefs against him, he might be in danger, but he still was going to live his life. So it just suggested to me a really kind of precarious understanding of freedom. And so that question of freedom, what freedom means for people who are, leaving prisons, that's a question that I had. And returning to their home neighborhoods, that's a question that I had when I got my first job at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And we were, and even before then, we were visiting, my partner and I were visiting family not too far from the Fillmore neighborhood, right up the hill. One day I kind of walk out and I go down the hill, and I learn that there's a distinction between down the hill and up the hill. And I walk into a Black-owned bookstore, Marcus Books. It's no longer there as a consequence of gentrification, right? But I walk in there and I start talking to the folks in there, and they start providing this kind of oral history of the Fillmore neighborhood, which is not unlike the history of neighborhoods in Philadelphia that I had studied. And so even though I hadn't actually moved to California yet, we spent a month out there visiting family. I knew very quickly that this could be the kind of neighborhood that I can root this question in, because it had gone through the same kinds of structural changes and experienced the same set of social forces that just about every other Black neighborhood in the country had. And then I learned a lot more about the Fillmore over the course of doing this research, and that question of freedom evolved a bit as well once I got into the field. But that's how I got that's how I got into the neighborhood, and that's how I got into that work. And I should also say that when I was in the neighborhood, and I lived there for 10 weeks one summer, and then I was able, with the support of a William T. Grant Early Career Scholar Award, was able to move up there so I could be there for an extended period of time. And as I was finishing up Between Good and Ghetto, as I was conducting field work for The Chosen Ones. And in fact, when Between Good and Ghetto came out, one of my key respondents in The Chosen Ones read Between Good and Ghetto, right? And so had an understanding of what it was I was doing there.
Right.
Yeah.
So you had these ideas, and it's almost as though the setting found you, or you were there at the moment.
Yeah. Although I did, I understood I was taking a job in Santa Barbara, which is not, a place for urban sociology.
Right.
I mean, there've been great urban sociologists who have moved through that place, and ethnographers who have done work there, but it wasn't the kind of city that I was interested in. And so I knew I was going to have to find another place to be.
Right.
And the Fillmore turned out to be, a rich site in lots of ways, and I learned so much from my time there and from the people there.
Yeah. The excerpts that you shared and a couple of passages that I found, they're storytelling. There's a lot of narrative involved. And you shared a portion from the introduction of Between Good and Ghetto. I actually took something out of the preface before the introduction came, and I share this with my students. And it actually talks a little bit, and I'm hoping you can elaborate a little bit on this story, about the cover of this. This is a mural that was outside a beauty salon that you happen to be in. Would you tell the rest of the story about?
Yeah, and so I should mention that cover, Marlon Newsome did that cover, and that's just like you said, the outside of a beauty salon in Philadelphia. And this cover, The Chosen Ones, was done by a local artist, Corey Pillows, a local artist from Oakland. And two of the things one of the things that I love about each of the books is the cover. In some ways, the cover may be better than what's inside the books, but but because they tell their own stories as well. And certainly valuing expressive culture and Black art, and understanding that is also a way of knowing and a way of telling, was important to me. And I love that is reflected on the work. Now, and so Corey is a professional artist. Marlon was not, he had, so when you write a book, you have to, at some point you get to the point where you're choosing the cover, right? And sometimes presses don't really like to have authors, too involved in that process, but I really wanted to see if I could grab some art to, at least offer up as a possibility. And so my partner and I returned to Philadelphia, and we were driving around the city trying to just kind of see what inspired us. And we came across this this mural, and my partner took this photo as well, and it's actually a longer photo, so it's been cut off and edited. And so then once we had the picture, the question is, well, you can't just take people's stuff, right? You have to get permission. And so when I went back to Philadelphia, I was trying to, get some information on this artist, and that's when I went back to the Black Beauty Salon, and I write about that in the preface. And I walk in, with my coat on, and I walk in and I start asking questions, and right away you could tell these women are like, "Who are you? What are you doing here? Why are you asking so many questions?" So levels of suspicion. And then I started talking to them about who I am and what I was doing, and that I was trying to find, the artist. And, very quickly, in a way that has become common for me in my experience, these stories and narratives, the stories about their own experiences with violence. So once I started telling what the book was about, it resonated really strongly with them. I remember a mother in the beauty salon, and I don't think I include this in the preface, in the beauty salon reaching into her purse to pull out a picture of her daughter who had been in a fight recently. And that just struck me as an example of the kind of literal, the baggage and the kind of literal trauma, right, that Black women and girls carry with them in relation to violence. And so then, once I got the name, and once the beauty salon owner figured out who I was, she was very generous and contacted the artist, and then we were able to connect and arrange for permissions for me to use the photo of his work, and he was very excited about it.
Yeah, one of the reasons I bring that up is because, let's face it, sometimes in a book we have to get through the preface, the introduction. I mean, it's worthy material, but yours starts right at the preface. We've got a story, we are in that world. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about you, your writing process. When did you decide to become a scholar? Did you always want to be a scholar?
No, I went to school as a business major because I wanted to make some money. Which is, the opposite of a scholar. But when I was an undergrad, I was drawn in by, by teachers who inspired me. Sociologists, and also at the time, folks who were also studying criminology, but through a sociological lens, were reading my work in classes and giving me really positive feedback. And I remember one professor in particular is the one who kind of planted the seed of doing this as a career. And then it kind of struck me as something that could be enjoyable and rewarding. It was a moment where there was a lot of conversation about Black youth, right? We were moving into the war on drugs and the war on violence. And I thought I would have something to contribute to that conversation. And I got a lot of, as I said, positive feedback and guidance on that. And so it was in college, as a consequence of the mentorship of a professor, that it began to me to seem like it's something that could be a possibility.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you enjoy writing in college?
I enjoyed writing in high school.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember one of my high school teachers telling me I was going to do well in freshman English. I didn't know what that meant, but I was like,
Was she right?
Well, he
sorry.
I think so.
Okay.
I think I did okay.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's actually I think it was my senior year in high school as well, when I thought about writing in that way, about maybe being good at writing, and then I got a lot of positive feedback in college as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about your writing process now. Once you have an idea, how do you proceed? Are you taking notes for a while? Do you outline? Talk us through a little bit about your process.
So as an ethnographer, writing is part of the process from the very beginning, right? And so you're taking field notes. So what I read today are in some cases, polished field notes. It's me using field notes as evidence. And so introducing the reader to the field note excerpt, and then providing some analysis, and then linking that to other pieces of analysis and other parts of and other field notes that maybe I've taken at a different time, but make sense, when I'm telling this story. And so So that's just to say that I'm writing all of the time at each stage of the research process.
Okay.
And then writing is its own part, its own phase of the research process when it comes to ethnographic work, right? And in these pieces that we're talking about, that part of representation, you are out of the field. You are trying to tell a larger story, using stories to do that. And so you are kind of thinking through the structure of the project in a different way. So for these two books, what made sense for me was to have time to spend time with the data and the analysis. And so that means having to block off a period of time, especially as an assistant professor and even as an associate professor, where you have for your writing for yourself, right? And so for a very long time, the kind of first couple of hours of each day, I really fought to make my own, so that I could just spend time writing. And so so sometimes I'd be working on a field note, polishing a field note. Sometimes I'd be working on, other levels of the analysis, trying to get a section really strong. Because by the time you're out of the field, you have already written up memos. In some cases, you have articles that I've used to kind of work out some ideas. And so now I'm kind of thinking through, like, where does this go now that I have this larger kind of understanding analysis of the project. And so you're always going through iterations, but the process part, I think, that allows you to do that is putting some structure around the time that you have, and some boundaries around the time that you have to write. And this was especially important when I was working on books. Right now, and these kinds of book projects, right now, the work that I'm doing, analyzing video records and working in collaboration with the research team, I've noticed that the process has changed a little bit. Mm-hmm. And in part because we're focused on articles, which is a different kind of thing than a larger book. And also just right now, the kind of time commitments I have, I wasn't then and am now a parent. And so so that has changed a bit. So one of the things I find myself doing a lot now is really working hard to find that time, but also I do a lot more jotting, in thinking prospectively about what I'll be writing or the kind of articles that we're working on. And then when I get a chance, I go through my notebook and bring all my jottings together and get them on, in a Word document, and then I work from there.
So jotting, you literally are handwriting?
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Do you carry around a notebook?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you taking notes all the time?
It feels like that.
Okay.
Whenever I can.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I mean, it's the kind of processing is always going on in the background when you have time to think. So often it's like, walking from the parking garage to my office, right? Mm-hmm. And then getting some things down. And so that's been a change, over the last, couple of years. Oh, actually, I guess over the last year or so, as I kind of put an end to the chosen ones, and that's out. And now I'm working like on the essay that I talked about, but also thinking about, what is the next book going to look like? And just what other kinds of things do I want to write now? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm going to put you on the spot. What's your favorite part of writing? And that includes research and field work. And what's your least favorite part of the process?
My favorite part of writing is just being alone in front of the computer and just like working on stuff and just and I'm a morning person, and so if it's in the early morning, just having that what feels like that one-on-one relationship with the kind of what you are producing, and I love the work of trying to represent the complexity of social life clearly and concisely. That is a challenge that I enjoy. And so that's one of my favorite parts of the work, actually, is getting to that point where you can be in my office alone with the work and trying to get it right. Right, trying to get it as right as possible.
So is that a revision process, or is that actually writing your first draft?
Whenever I have that time, that feels good.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, because like I said,
Yeah.
sometimes the first draft is a field note that you've already created, while you were still in the field,
right.
And now you have that in front of you.
Right.
But sometimes you are writing new material, to frame that or a part of the analysis. But
And I want to reframe my question,
Yeah.
actually. I don't want to say what's your least favorite, but what's the most difficult, the most challenging, what's the biggest struggle for you personally as a writer, researcher, ethnographer?
I think the weight of getting it right, getting the analysis right, and that's where the writing is part of it, because even one word, you can't change the data, right? So you went out in the field, you observed, you interviewed people, and they said what they said, and they did what they did, and now you have that. And you can't change that.
Right.
But you want to revise, right, your kind of set of hunches, hypotheses, theoretical propositions that you have in a way that fits what it is you observed. And getting that fit, that can come down to one word. So even in going back and looking through this, it's hard because I'm like, I might change that word if I was writing it today. Even though I feel like each book is a representation, is right in its way. You know, so it's not that I don't like that part. I like that part as well, but it's hard.
Yeah. Right. So when you're there alone with your computer, you've got quiet, you like that. Do you have an audience in mind that you're addressing as you're working on this at that process, or maybe at other stages in the process? Who is your audience?
Yeah, so I talk with my graduate students about this as well, and so sometimes the audience is your committee, and so certainly right there, right. And so when I was a graduate student, that was the case. But then as I was working on these two books, and in somewhat maybe selfishly, I'm trying to figure out a set of questions for myself first. Right, I'm trying to answer a set of questions, and then I want to kind of represent that. I want to, and I want to represent it in a way, and this goes back to my kind of Black feminist, epistemology, in a way that can be, that is accessible, and so the audience is folks who could read this, right? And so certainly as an academic, there's an academic audience, and there's a set of academic and conversations that I'm involved in and that I speak to through my work, and people who are reading the work see that. But like I said, my key respondent, in The Chosen Ones read Between a Good and Good, he's like, oh yeah, that reminded me of my sister. And that's hard work, right? To be able, I mean, it may not be for some people, but it was hard work for me to figure out like how to write in that way. So when I think about, so there are multiple audiences, but I do think that, again, the Black feminist epistemology is important because I'm not necessarily I'm writing to figure out and represent, not necessarily to convince. And this is particularly important when you're talking and writing about, in the work, Black women and girls, Black men and boys, because there is this world of ideas that people have about the folks that I'm writing about already. And I could spend a lot of time trying to convince them why their ideas are wrong-headed.
Right.
But then I miss the opportunity to represent social life and to tell the stories in the way that I want to tell them, in a way that I think they need to be told.
Right.
So if and this comes up at different stages of the writing process and editing and review, you have to be thinking all the time about how much attention you are giving to that and how focused you can be. How to center yourself in a tradition that already values Black life and Black humanity, that understands that as a starting point, and then tells a story from there.
Do you have a first reader? Do you have a person that you go to that you share your work with? Yeah,
my partner is my first. She's also a wonderful editor, and so it's gotten harder for her to be my first reader over time because other folks want to read stuff. She does, she's a professional, but certainly she is the one that I'm in conversation with, whether or not she's right in front of me, a good deal. And we've been involved in conversations over time that are certainly reflected in the analysis that I've prepared. But I think everyone has to have someone who will just tell you how it is. And she has no problems doing that.
Good. I'm going to go to a few questions that my students have. Do you ever have writer's block?
Yeah. And so the last chapter of The Chosen Ones was a very hard chapter for me to write. And I don't know that it was writer's block as much as it was me recognizing how difficult it was to write about this young man, who I knew, who I had interviewed, who I had spent some time with, who was killed. And when I met him, and I was working on this research project, and 5 years later, I'm speaking at his funeral. And our work is our work, but our work is not absent emotional dimensions. And it was hard. And he had been in the book in one way, and over time, and since that happened, I restructured the book. And this was during like the final revision, so that his story was its own chapter. But it was hard to do the work to finish that chapter because it was so emotionally heavy. Yeah.
Besides being a writer, a researcher, you're a teacher. And you actually, I don't have it here, but you actually, you have a shout out to your students in something that I read. So talk a little bit about how teaching informs your writing, writing informs your teaching. Are you able to do both at the same time?
Well, it's, and so again, the Black feminist epistemology and understand that knowledge is produced in conversation with others. And that's why I think for me, when I was at Santa Barbara, it was a wonderful place to be as a young scholar, but coming to the Department of African American Studies and being in conversation with the students I'm now in conversation with, having a different starting point when you have a room full of Black women, women of color, just a more diverse group of students, it enriches you. It energizes me. It raises a different set of questions that might emerge otherwise. So who you are in conversation with is deeply important, and I have a lot of respect for my students and their capacity as thinkers. And so just to be in conversation with them helps me, and then in turn, I think I know, helps the writing. Yeah.
And what about your writing process are you able to share with them? I understand.
You might want to ask them that. Okay, they might feel like, you mean instruction or my process?
Both.
So sometimes I'll bring in material that I'm working on into class, for sure. And then, I try to encourage them to have a writing practice with the understanding, and this is true for me as well, that doesn't mean that you do it all the time. Life events happen. They've happened to me. Things happen that throw you off, but that it makes it a lot easier if you have something to come back to. And so if you have a practice in place, then that provides the kind of structure that will allow you to do well when it comes to writing, throughout the course of your career, especially as there are these other kind of these other kind of obligations that will be, fighting to take some of that time away. So I know that the work that I'm doing now, and it is why I wanted to be here, is influenced by my students and their brilliance, and just learning from just listening and reading their work as well. There's
an old saw that if you want to be a better writer, you need to read. Talk a little bit about what you read, what you've read over the years, how that fits into your life.
Well, it's harder to find time to read now than it used to be. But I do think, and thinking about Between Good and Ghetto, because it was my first book, and I was also thinking about, well, how do you represent Black people? How do you write Black people in a way that is, reflective of, as I said, the complexity and the diversity, and how do you describe skin tone, right? How do you do those kinds of things well? And so I read the work of writers, Toni Morrison, who did that work. So I read fiction, I read nonfiction, I read James Baldwin, I read Sister Souljah, I read just as much as I could, just to have examples of that, especially with the first book, and that helped a lot.
Yeah. Has that changed over? So that certainly informed your actual ability to describe something in writing. I mean, you and Toni Morrison, the late great Toni Morrison, were working with the same. You had words on paper, so you could learn something from her. Are there other writers that you went to for the chosen ones? Are there other writers you're going to now? Or not? Is there what are you reading right now?
Right now, I'm reading a gift from a student. Breathe by Imani Perry, who's a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. And it's a letter to her sons, and I almost wish I'd been able to read it while I was writing The Chosen Ones, because it captures the fear and the vulnerability associated with Black masculinity. So that's what I'm reading now.
What about news, nonfiction? What are your sources?
Well, I read a lot. I read a lot of news, and so I feel like I'm reading the news all the time. But at the same time, and also like documentaries, for sure. But it's also, what I've found recently is that it's hard to do this work and also to be taking that in all the time.
Yeah.
And so I have to kind of regulate what I'm consuming as a reader, even though knowing that it will influence. It has is relevance to the work I'm doing. So, for example, when I watch Ava DuVernay's When They See Us, I could only watch that in 10-minute increments, right? And that's because of how closely associated that work was with the research that I had done over the years. And I could see it. Like, I could see the young people, that I encountered over, the years, being those young people and being ensnared and entrapped in that way. And so there's a pain that's associated with it as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I want to go.
And I should also say the other thing that I did a lot, especially early on in my career, is to read about writing. So read how to write well. Read about how to write well.
Okay.
And so that was an important piece of it as well.
Do you remember what you read?
Writing well.
Okay.
On writing well. How do we get started was another one. I actually took a class, extension course when I was in the field, and I think this was before Between Good and Ghetto was done, at UCLA, Writers Extension, right? Creative writing. I took a course in creative writing. Okay. Right. And so the essays that we read for that. Yeah. So to read about writing, and Howard Becker's Writing for Social Scientists, which is great. And so to read about writing was very helpful as well.
Okay, good. As I said, I want to leave some time for audience questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and we'll repeat the question just because we don't have a mic. So I'll let you.
Nikki?
Okay, so my question is, I know that you've been trained as an ethnographer, and Black feminist ethnography really anchors your research. Are there other methods that you've started exploring, or other modes of thinking and research that you want to incorporate into your writing?
So the question is, I was trained as an ethnographer, and Black feminist ethnography really grounds my work, but are there other kind of modes or methods that I'm thinking about incorporating now? And that's the case with the project that I've been working on over the last several years, analyzing video recordings. And so there are different ways that you can use the visual to tell a story. When I was in the field, I worked with someone, Raymond Washington, who had been collecting video recordings of daily life in his neighborhood for years and years and years. And that's really how I've started to I began the work analyzing video recording of police encounters with the public in a very kind of social, scientific way. But I was able to connect him over the course of a couple of years with a documentary filmmaker, which then brought me into the role of a producer, right? And the two of them worked together to develop 2 documentary shorts about life in the neighborhood. And so that struck me as another way to tell a story that was influenced by the ethnographic work that I'd done, but also required a different set of skills, that I didn't necessarily have. And so I think more now about how to use, and I'm thinking about this in particular right now, how to think about the various collections of video recordings that we have as evidence, as data, as illustration. And so I think that that is in an area where I've grown since my initial training and kind of going out into the field, direct observation, participant observation, in-depth interviews, is thinking about what it means to interact with this visual, media. And again, I think that's why my experience in this department, in our Department of African American Studies, is one that is pushing me as a scholar, as all around. I have people who are doing that work that I can learn from. Yeah.
I have a question about writing as an appellation. And the writing, especially a book, actually a book that isn't just an academic book, there's a limited conversation with the reader that follows. And in the case of writing about abolition, there's a really easy for a reader to absorb stories, ethnographic accounts of the prison system, the criminal justice system, in a way that gets picked up just in terms of we should make these same institutions better. And I'm curious how through writing you can inoculate against those things and set those terms more forcefully early on, especially in writing that is not first and foremost a political manifesto, but it's very much telling stories.
Can you restate that question?
I don't know if I can.
And so, in some ways, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. So you come to a piece of work, research and writing, right? So this is writing that you've done that's based on research that you've done, or yeah, or the case that you're thinking about.
That is the writing that I do, yeah. I'm thinking about the work that you're talking about.
And so how does that, how do you reflect that in the work? And I think, so the answer is that different people do this differently. And my thinking has certainly evolved over time for lots of different reasons, including the political moments that we have moved through, personal experiences, experiences on the national level. And so I think one thing is to be open to evolution as a scholar is really important. And so when you think about being an ethnographer, openness, curiosity, and humility are really important. If you already know what you want to say, then you do not have to go out into the field, right? You do not have to spend the time there, right? Just say it. And actually, I'm at a point in my life now where more the writing that I'll probably do in the future, at least some of that in the near term, will be me just saying it, right? Based on what I know. But it's really different to be tied to an ethnographic project because you have to, be true to that. At the same time, what you know is what you know, and what you bring to it is what you bring to it. And so it does matter that it's you, because you can see things that someone else may miss altogether. And so the representation that you provide can contribute to that conversation, is part of the conversation, and it reflects, so for example, how you are thinking about abolition. Like, so for me, in that excerpt that I shared, that is the tension between reform and abolition, right? Let's trying to save this young man's life, because that's what I felt in the moment, but trying to protect, constrain, right? And then in fact, I wouldn't do that if he was, this is the kind of interrogation of myself. Would I have done that if he was a woman sharing her experience of sexual violence? I would never say shh, 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 right? And so then what is that, what is all that? So I'm trying to figure that out. If I already knew what I wanted to say about it, I could just go say it, right? But I'm actually really trying to engage and figure that out. And why is it that that's a response that has seemed reasonable when it comes to one case and not the other? And how am I forestalling certain possibilities out of love and care, right? Out of love and care, wanting things to be better for this young person, right? But in doing that, I'm just reproducing the same structures that he is, he's challenging. And so then I learned something about that will inform my future work, but I also insert that into the text so other people can see, right, that this is me figuring it out, right? And so you may think that these kind of reformist tendencies is the way to go, but here I'm showing you the limitations of that and what else is possible. So I didn't read like what I write after that about the connections to Black Lives Matter and all of that. and so I'm just trying to illustrate in an honest way in the text. Now, for a different kind of piece, I would just, tell it, right? But I'm trying to engage my analysis with what is I observe in the field. Does that respond to? But it should matter who you are. Who you are does influence your work, whether people acknowledge it or not, right? And so I do encourage my students to bring a critical epistemology to their work.
I actually have a related question from my students, and I'm going to voice it. They want to know, a few of them, what advice would you give to a young writer, particularly one who have an underrepresented voice, may not, be prominent at the academy? What advice would you give to that
So
writer?
when you say prominent in the academy, meaning?
White.
That person is not
established.
Yes, well, I do this all the time.
Yes.
It's exactly the students that. And this is, that's the kind of origin of the essay. I think one of the violences that can be done to students in the academy, particularly students who are coming from backgrounds like that I write about or who are outsiders in any way, is that if they have an interest in a set of experiences that emerge from their lived experience, they are told things like, that's me-search, not research. And even in cases where people think they're being helpful, we want you to succeed in the academy, that's me-search, not research, you need to do, but then that means other people get to be the kind of dominant voice on people from their communities, from our communities. And so what I spend a lot of time doing is encouraging students to think of themselves as connected to a tradition that exists and is valid even if other people don't know about it, even if their advisors who may be very well-intentioned don't know about it. So my work, in part because of the mentorship I received, is reflective of the Black intellectual tradition, which late Manning Marable described as descriptive, corrective, and prescriptive. So descriptive, describing Black life and valuing the subjectivity of Black life. Corrective, pushing back against the theories of inferiority as explanatory. And prescriptive, how should the world be? What do you think after having done this work, that it is transformative and that we should be working to challenge and end white supremacy? that's the project. And so I encourage students, because they're not always going to get that training, and this is why some students are in my class from different disciplines across the university. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And then once you are connected to that tradition, you understand that the sets of concerns that you have are an enduring set of concerns, and that writing from that tradition is actually a strength, right? Not a weakness, makes your work even stronger. And to use that, as a touchstone, but also as a guide. Once students begin to do that, and if they're able to do it in community with other students, then I begin to see I see them get energized. So they can move over the course of a semester to feeling injured because they have been injured, and as alienated because they have been alienated, to a much more confident researchers and scholars and thinkers, and they do that often in community with others. And so I would tell students who ask that question to remember your work is important. That's what my mentor told me all the time. Your work is important. It's important. Even if other people don't realize it right away, it's important. And we need the stories that you are going to tell. It matters that it's you.
And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us today.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nikki Jones.